Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Juno here. I kind of don't want to make this video, so I'm going to keep it really brief. It's just super late for me right now, and I need to be getting some sleep. I've not been too well recently. I'm sure I can appreciate your sympathy for me right now. But alright, I'm just going to get straight to it. So, I was talking this over with a buddy of mine, and he came up with this notion of calling it the Milkpill. I'm not sure that's going to make it to the video title, but nevertheless, it's an interesting look at it. But what I wanted to focus on today was creativity and dairy products. So some people have this interpretation of dairy products. Well, I suppose it's like a myth, right? Like if you want to have like scary dreams, nightmares, wild dreams, you can eat cheese or drink milk before you go to bed. And I definitely have to admit that I've always drunk a lot of milk. I've always been big on dairy. I've always found it really satisfying to drink. And I like all dairy products like yogurts and everything else. But here's the thing, right? I was trying to understand the mechanism of action of why milk might have some sort of like hallucinogenic effect or might be able to influence your brain chemistry when you sleep. Is there any legitimacy behind that? And through doing this investigation, I began to realize that, well, for one, the vast majority of the world is lactose intolerant. So the only milk they ever have access to is when they're very young. And if it was intended or meant to have some sort of developmental property that increased neuronal activity, that would seem to make sense during that growth period of your life. However, what if we're able to extend that beyond then with the enzymes that are able to break down and absorb lactose in an efficient way? What do you get out of that in the long term? And specifically, why would we have dairy products only in certain places, right? Like why didn't it occur in other places as well? I'll look into this in a minute. But to begin with, I want to give a brief overview of like what are the dairy products out there and where are they most popular. So I've got a little scattered here of a few options, but briefly to say, they are popular in, there's some in South Asia, you do have a few Asian ones, but mostly it seems to be around the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe originally, and then obviously extended to the United States eventually. So why is this, right? Okay, well, predominantly it's because of the lactose gene, so the lactose tolerance gene. So that's why you're getting more of it in these areas. But it seems to have a number of stages to it. So historically speaking, there are elements of dairy consumption even in ancient times. So let me just see here. So firstly, let's start with cattle. So it appears that cattle were around at least since the Neolithic age, but they may not have been around for dairy production. It was probably just for the meat on them. They're fairly compliant animals. They've got a herd instinct. They're relatively they're not particularly assertive. They're quite easy to domesticate through their attitude. So this thing of an auroch being probably the first animal that was cultivated for use as what we would consider today to be like the progenitor to the cow, and that was about 10,500 years ago, and it was probably around the Near East, Anatolia, Levant, and Iran. It appears that at some point, just being a herd animal like goats and sheep were, they would have just been naturally sort of grazing in areas and then being herded by shepherds, and so then they would be considered like a signature of wealth, and then they could have been used as a type of currency at some point. And then you go on to the more modern the more modern industry of livestock. So if we move forward to having a look at where they may have existed in ancient cultures, what we find is, for example, we look at Egyptian cheese. It's got a long history and it was important in the Egyptian diet, probably originated in the Middle East and manufactured in murals in Egyptian tombs at least 2000 BC. So we know it's going to be at least from then, probably from before. And that's just the iconography that's available to us. Evidence of cheese making itself exists at least 5,000 years ago, the first dynasty in Egypt, and there's further examples of it after then. We see evidence of dairy products in ancient Greece. So it appears that there was a kind of milk cake made from dried milk, and while people in the country drank milk while it was fresh, it probably wasn't used in cooking or sold in towns and cities because there was no preservatives, there was no way of maintaining the milk in long term, so it wouldn't have made a very good product for sale at a market. Nevertheless, there seems to have been at least some evidence of there being butter, which is like the next one of the next products derived from milk, and there are some examples of that. But then cheese and yogurt is where the majority of the preserved dairy product is able to be distributed and sold for commerce. So that's when you begin to see that it's widespread, at least in the 8th century BCE. And apparently there's even a vocabulary associated with it in the Odyssey, so there's a very famous reference for you. And the Greeks enjoyed other dairy products, curdled milk products, cottage cheeses, yogurts, not just from cows, but from goats and ewes and other places as well, probably. And it also says it was eaten in combination with honey and vegetables. So, we clearly have evidence of ancient cultures enjoying dairy products from specific places, at least Mesopotamia, at least Egypt, definitely Greece. There's also reports of it being eaten in the Roman Empire as well. So, again, very similar situation with the milk. Because it was being locally produced, it was only people in the countryside were drinking the milk themselves. But the dairy products that could be made and brought to market because they had a longer shelf life were then able to be effectively distributed and sold at market. And then so you would have some other elements of it, like cheeses, like yogurts, maybe dried versions of milk as well. There is references as well to barbarians drinking a lot of milk. So I think it's in terms of the tribes from what we would call today the Alps were known to be milk drinkers, and this seems to have contributed somewhat to the way that they were perceived from inside the empire. All right, so I think we can establish then there is at least a historic precedent for the presence of dairy in various places. So you might be asking yourself, why, Juno, are you talking about milk? What has this got to do with anything really? Why is this significant? All right. So if we could imagine why someone would be able to use milk, well, we see that one of the major stepping stones, one of the major obstacles, is that keeping milk in a usable format was something not immediately available to most people. So the people who were producing the milk, had the livestock anyway. They may have been able to have some milk, but it wasn't commercially viable for a long time until the development of cheeses and yogurts, where it could be stored and sold on. However, these are references being used from the Mediterranean and the Levant, essentially. What we may find is that in less documented civilizations, you could have had people from colder climes were able to store milk for much longer. Now, if this was the case, they may not have needed to rely on things like butter for their dairy intake, for their calcium intake. They may have been able to use fresh milk for longer. So I wouldn't be surprised if you did see more archaeological evidence coming from, for example, Scandinavia, or maybe other places closer to the Arctic Circle. As long as they had some access to cattle, I imagine there probably would have been a much greater uptake for dairy. Alright, so the reason I think this is quite significant is, as I said before, lactose tolerance is only prevalent in about 30% of the world's population. Now, I think this, as I referenced early in the video, I think this is quite significant because there are some theories about the evolution of man and his sort of ingenuity, his ability to be creative and to find new solutions to problems, is sometimes related to like early apes digesting various roots and flowers that may have had some hallucinogenic properties about them. Okay, and it could have been that while in these compromised states, that they would have done things that normal monkeys or normal apes or normal early man wouldn't have normally considered doing. But then enough of them were doing these things and then making discoveries, however unintentional it was, and then they would go on to use them. And so that would be like an early form of kind of forced evolution into invention, into creativity, where they were finding out new things just through this process of basically getting high and then doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing or didn't think were good ideas normally, but then finding out that actually they were incredibly beneficial or useful. Okay, so if I can acknowledge that's the case, I put it to you that there is some possibility that because Western man has had access to dairy products because of his lactose tolerance, is it not possible that dairy products may have had not a hallucinogenic influence, but some sort of a creative impetus on the brain of Western man that is contributory to why he is known historically to have been, most of the important inventions have come from the European theatre. Most of the most significant advances in mankind have come from the European theatre. And I know you can speculate on things like gunpowder came from China, but then you can say, well, China didn't actually do anything with gunpowder. It wasn't until it came to Europe that it was more advanced and more developed, and it was utilized in different ways. I mean, it's one thing to fire a rocket across a field, it's another thing to fire a rocket at the moon, and that was more a European descendant project than it was a Chinese one. So, and this isn't by any means trying to compete. I'm not saying that these different demographics should be competing. What I'm saying is, if we could identify these contributory factors to things like creativity, that would make them available for everyone to use, or at least be available for them to know about. Even if you're not lactose tolerant, you could still understand the advantage dairy plays and then find the mechanism with which it uses to add this ability, and then you could find another way of getting that, whatever that is. So my approach to that, I suppose, would be to look at, well, what are the primary constituents of dairy that we know are already useful? And one of them would be calcium, obviously. Like, we all know that milk and cheese and stuff like that is all full of calcium, full of proteins. Could that be having an effect on a neurological level? Possibly. Yes, it could, because we know calcium is a electrolyte, and it could be being used. It is used, in fact, in neurons, in calcium-gated ion channels. There's also free calcium as well. So calcium could be a factor. I absolutely agree. Maybe a ready source of calcium, like dairy products, could be contributing to a better neuronal function. I would also speculate and say that glutamate itself, okay, so one of the primary neurotransmitters in the brain, may be having an enhanced function due to dairy consumption. So this may be either directly from glutamate being ingested itself. Some people may say, but glutamate doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier, so it can't be that. But then, the contributory molecule to glutamate, the precursor would be glutamine, and that is, I believe, able to pass through the blood-brain barrier, and you can still source that from many of the same sources. So if we say, like, we already know that cheese, for example, very, very high in glutamate. And as I said, the first example I gave was this idea that it can cause very vivid dreams. So could it be related? But if you are looking just at glutamine itself, not glutamate, then it would appear that you would be looking for, let's just have here, what does it say? Yeah, good sources include dairy, right there, right? Like, so glutamine, the precursor molecule, is also found in dairy as well. So that could be contributing to enhanced neuronal activity. And the reason, like here, for example, like when you look at glutamine deficiencies, okay, what is actually being referenced here? So, for example, it shows, like, I spoke in another video, for example, about how I suspected that repeated or long-term stress would contribute to neurodegenerative conditions through excited excitotoxicity having a corrosive effect on glial cells, which in turn would deregulate their ability to maintain neuronal myelination. And it says in this example here that having a glutamine deficiency can be caused by shock or stress, and also immune disorders and intense exercise. So this being the case, this I believe does kind of support my previous hypothesis to some degree. Nevertheless, if that is something that we need to look at, I think it's reasonable to assume that glutamine may have at least a partial impact upon neurofunctions. And it does even reference the fact that lack of it in the diet would contribute to a deficiency. So it's not necessary that it's just purely being produced in the brain as glutamate would be, synthesized in the brain. Glutamine clearly, on some level, as the precursor molecule, is passing the blood-brain barrier and being supplied directly from the diet into the CNS. Alright, so for the most part, I'm happy to leave it there. I'm happy to say I think I've given you at least a partial background to my hypothesis on dairy and how increasing intake of dairy may be playing a role or factor in active and available glutamate for neurotransmission, which in turn is probably making people who are lactose tolerant more neuronally active and perhaps more predisposed to transmissions from neurosynapses. And if that was the case, that would provide some benefit to base creativity. Maybe not intelligence directly, but at least creativity, I think, may be affected by that. And the reason I say that is because when you try and gauge creativity psychometrically, you are looking at things not necessarily arithmetic, all right, but you're looking more, so it's not just simple processing, but it is more spatial awareness. It is concepts, associations, consequences, responses, sensitivity, fluency, flexibility. So these are transformative interactions. These are transformative engagements. These are not kind of linear in their motion. They're not just, you take one element and then you make an addition or a subtraction or a multiplication to another element and then find a solution. It's more fluent than that. It's more dynamic than that. It's more organic than that. Which again is why I speculate here that maybe dairy plays a role in preparing the brain in some way, or making bioavailability of certain molecules higher, so then they're able to be utilized in a more ready state. And here's just a very brief overview of a glutaminergic synapse. But it does show, you do take the glutamine, turn it into glutamate, have it in these vesicles, and then it's released before it is at the synaptic cleft. And then it does travel towards the postsynaptic cell and the neuron there with the glial cell here. Oh, does it actually say? Yeah, it is astrocytes. Yeah, it does list it there. Yeah, and that's where it's uptaked, and then it binds to whatever. It binds to the voltage gate or whatever, and then it's passed through as necessary to continue the action potential. Anyway, so that's my conclusion. I absolutely be interested in anyone's point of view on that. Do you think dairy contributes to creativity? I would love to get some analysis of artists, find out if truly creative people have some history with dairy, whether with themselves or a familial history with it. See if it is something that is utilized even today. I'd be interested to know. Or is there some other mechanism perhaps taking place? Or are there any other ways that this type of mechanism could be exploited, this type of mechanism could be adapted? It would also, it might draw interest from the opposite sector as well. Like, let's look at, if it's not a glutamate promoter, what if it's a glutamate inhibitor? What if it's a sort of GABA promoter instead? What if there are foods or dietary supplements that are GABA promoters? Would they stifle creativity, right? So would they lead to sort of more docile, more compliant mentalities? Perhaps, if you eat a lot of soy, for example, I think has high amount of GABA in it. I think fermented foods have a lot of GABA, or may have the precursor molecules that promote GABA production. Could that be an effect? Interesting questions. All right, I've spoken for way long enough. I want to go to bed. Thank you very much for sticking with me for that, and I hope to see you around.